So thank you everyone for joining. It is our pleasure to join with Menas on these breakfast briefings. Ideally, we would have loved to have hosted you in our London office with breakfast. Obviously that can't be done, so thank you, Charles, for arranging this. I just wanted to give a very brief flavor of what Evershed Sutherland does broadly, and then with respect to our highly developed practice in Iran. Charles, if we can stay on the slide we're on, thank you. Broadly, Evershed Sutherland is a global law firm, one of the top 20 largest law firms in the world, as you can see from that very brief map, coverage across the world. We have 69 offices, sorry, one slide back, thank you. We have 69 offices in 34 countries. We have a particular strength in the Middle East. We are the largest international law firm that's in the Middle East. We have 7 offices across the Middle East. Unfortunately, those offices don't currently include an office in Tehran, but we do have Iranian qualified lawyers who practice from our office in Dubai. Charles, next slide, thank you. So Evershed Sutherland has an extremely rich and lengthy practice of helping our clients with Iran and Iranian related entities. We've done high-level Iranian-related work for over 30 years for both local and international businesses, local Iranian businesses going out from Iran, whether they are private entities or whether they're owned by the state or connected with the state. And we've also done a lot of work with international clients going into Iran. The reason we feel that we have such an extensive Iran practice for so long is because we do understand the specificities of working in Iran. I've put up some of those on the screen, as I think many people on this slide, on this webinar will understand, and Bijan certainly understands far better than I do. Policy making in Iran is quite specific, and we are able to help our clients coming into the country to navigate the specificities and the issues that arise from policy making through multiple bodies and multiple ways of policy making, which obviously does have an impact on large businesses coming in. We also understand international sanctions on Iran. We do a lot of advice on international sanctions, particularly during those periods where sanctions change quickly and they have a material impact on our clients. We also do a lot of work on corporate structuring within Iran for our international clients going into Iran, where we are able to help them navigate Iran's commercial code, and also for our clients coming in, where we can help them structure their investments externally when they go into Iran to ensure that they have the most profitable investments and the most suitable investments. And the way we can do all of this is because, as I mentioned before, we have sound Iranian law capability in our Middle East offices. And we also have access to some very prominent local Iranian law firms. We do have a best friend firm based in Tehran, and that's Bijan Associates. And I believe there are some of my colleagues from Bijan on this webinar, so thank you for joining. So this is how we help our clients going into Iran. There are 2 practice areas that we're currently working substantially on. Charles, could I ask you to slip slides, please? The 2 practice areas, as you'd expect, where we're currently doing a lot of work, are our international sanctions practice. We have a huge amount of experience on international sanctions with Iran, also with many other countries that are subject of international sanctions. We help our clients navigate the sanctions. We help our clients deal with regulatory issues. We help global institutions in the event of deferred prosecution agreements. We have a substantial amount of experience, both in the US sanctions and US entities, and also European and UK. The other area of practice within Evershed Sutherland that is quite specific and quite extensive relating to Iran at the moment is our international disputes practice. As you can see on the screen, we've advised on Iranian disputes for over 30 years at the highest level of government. We have successfully defended the Republic of Iran in its first ever investment treaty claim, which was dismissed entirely, and Iran was found entirely not guilty of the charges that were brought against it. We have also advised Iranian entities and foreign companies on a whole range of disputes arising from transactions involving Iranian businesses. These have been in international arbitrations and have also been in disputes before various high courts. We've recently had 2 very notable successes before the English High Court, where English judges have applied English law to provide justice in favor of our Iranian clients, which we think are quite positive. And as a result of all of this hard work that we've been doing, we've been ranked as one of the top firms for Iranian matters globally by Legal 500. We're also ranked as one of the world's top 10 legal practices. You can see on the screen some quotes from our clients in relation to the work that we do in Iran. The quote that I'm particularly proud of is the second last one, which says, very good at making local requirements understandable to international clients. And I think this is quite important because Iran is it's a very specific place to do business. And without having an international firm that can help you and without having local contacts that can help you as well, I think it's very easy for clients to struggle and to get lost. I think with that, I'll hand over to Charles and Bijan. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Greg. By contrast, we are a very small company, but we have been around for a very long time. We actually began working with Fred Chumley, which later became part of Eversheds, back in the early 1980s. And since then, we've developed into a strategic, political and integrated integrity risk consultancy firm. Broadly, our three different offerings are political risk, business intelligence, and also strategic advice, including work on arbitration cases on a number of different countries. And we'll send you further information, no doubt, later. Despite our name, we've actually been working on areas outside the MENA region as well as inside since 1988. We began working on the MENA region in 1979, and here you can see some of the work that we've been involved in. I won't go into detail on it now, but it just gives you a flavor of what we're involved in. In addition to that, Iran has always been a core country. In fact, it was founded by our British Farsi-speaking founder, and he'd been an expert for over a decade before I joined, and I've been there for a long time. We worked on the Iran-US Claims Tribunal cases with Evershed's Paris office. We've been working on, we've had a publication on Iran now for 32 years, and Bijan has been our editor for the last 25 years. We've also conducted many consultancy projects and on a whole wide range of things as far as Iran is concerned. Our publication, Iran Strategic Focus, comes out every month. Bijan is our principal author on that, and if you'd like to see a copy, we'd be very happy to send you the latest issue. In fact, I think the latest issue comes out in the next couple of days. With that, I'm just going to pass you over to Bijan. You can see here that he has been working both in Tehran for a very long time and for the last few years based in Vienna. I think there's no doubt that the Atiyah Group, if any international company wanted to buy, or consultancy company wanted to buy an Iranian partner or link up with an Iranian partner, the Atiyah Group was the one which they would have chosen. Since 1918, he's now set up in Vienna, and I'll ask him to provide some more details on that. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen, hand over to Bijan. So Bijan, you can share your screen, okay? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm just going to start the presentation.
Okay.
So, great to be here. Thank you for the introduction. I'm not going to talk much more about our company in Vienna. Let's talk about the Iranian economy. Our topic is basically trying to understand how the Iranian economy is doing under the sanctions regime, which intensified since May 2018, and a couple of more recent crises, the COVID-19 crisis and also low oil prices. So what I will try to do is I will share some macroeconomic indicators with you, try to analyze government responses and its and their efficiency in tackling the issues. I will talk about the future of the economy, but also try to understand what these economic developments and the projection for the next couple of years, what it means actually for Iran's domestic and also regional agendas. And I will close by talking about the implications of these developments on international business. I know that you can send your questions through the chat box. Charles will try to catch the questions and then put them to me at a later stage. I will go through, I think it will be another 35 to 40 minutes roughly that I go through this, and then I look forward to your comments and questions. So let's start. Let's start with some basic facts. Since May 2018, when the US withdrew from the so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, the Iranian economy has experienced what economists call stagflation. So concurrent stagnation and high inflation. And it has been a very difficult 2 years for the Iranian economy. You may remember 2018 when this policy of so-called maximum pressure was announced. The expectation was that the Iranian economy would collapse within a few months. Well, 2 years later, and 2 crises later, and the economy is still there, and I don't think it will collapse. And one of the reasons why it's so resilient, it is that it is actually a very diverse economy. If you look at this graph, these are the figures for the Iranian year that ended in March 2019. So not the most recent figures, but it roughly gives you an idea that the Iranian economy is actually a service-based economy. It's not an oil and gas economy, even though the petroleum sector in any given year can be somewhere between 18 to 25%, but it's not the largest sector. So restricting Iran's oil and gas exports, what was the core of the sanctions, well, has hurt the Iranian economy and has also limited Iran's access to hard currency, but it has not really collapsed the Iranian economy. In fact, before the recent crisis, before the emergence of the coronavirus crisis, the projection was that Iran will actually return to a very modest growth in the current Iranian year. But that has obviously been severely undermined by the coronavirus crisis. Obviously, Iran is suffering from the impact of the US sanctions, but that's not the only thing. It's important to understand that there is an internal dynamics as well. Most importantly, the economy is suffering internally from mismanagement and corruption. I argue that if they really managed to contain corruption and divert some of the resources that are flowing into corrupt practices into the economy, it would actually cover the expected budget deficit this year. I will come back to the budget deficit in a few minutes. So mismanagement and corruption are an important issue to understand, and it actually links interestingly to some of the most recent actions by the Iranian government. Obviously, the implications of the current COVID-19 pandemic, the country has been under some sort of lockdown, even though it was not a full lockdown in Iran over the past 3 months, and it has had a severe impact. I will come to some of these impacts in a minute. And obviously, the collapse of the global oil prices. I mean, even though Iran is not really exporting a lot of crude oil because of the US sanctions, the collapse of the oil price has both a psychological impact, but also an impact on all the export items that Iran is exporting that derive from oil and gas, especially gas-based industries, petrochemicals, cement, aluminum, and so on. So it's an interesting dynamics, and Iran basically has been hit by 3 crises, and their interplay is leaving a major footprint. And this table shows you basically the latest economic indicators. is the current year, and the right column is projection for the next Iranian year. As you can see, 2 years of stagnation, 2 years of negative growth. So last year, minus 7.6%, and the current year, the projection is that the economy will decline by about 6%. These are figures from the World Bank. But interestingly, even the World Bank predicts a growth year for the Iranian economy next year. And this is where that diversity that I mentioned earlier, the dominance of the service sectors that obviously can react much faster to crises that Iran is experiencing right now. Iran doesn't have a huge foreign debt, even though the government has a lot of internal debt, but net government borrowing is about 4% to 5% of the GDP. So it's not a critical issue. The current account balance, as you see, is negative, but it's also very small compared to other nations. The real negative indicators in Iran are, one, inflation, even though, as you can see, the trend in inflation is downward. So last Iranian year, inflation was about 41%. This year, projection is it will be about 34%, and next year, slightly lower. But obviously, high inflation and high economic contraction means that we are still inside a stagflation that leaves a lot of footprints, including obviously a negative impact on unemployment. So Iran was starting to gradually create some needed jobs up to about 6 months ago. Unemployment fell below 11% for the first time after a long time, but then is now going up again, and it will probably stay above 12% for a couple of years. We should also not forget that Iran has a very young population, and that obviously puts more pressure on the market. So youth unemployment is about 26 to 30%, depending on which season you look at. So it's a very important socioeconomic fact to remember unemployment, because when we look at the government remedies, it will be very much connected to employment opportunities. Just a couple of graphs to show you that Iran actually was doing okay before the US withdrew from the JCPOA. So if you look at the left part of these graphs, inflation was about 7% in 2015, 2016. And then you can see the impact of US sanctions. But back then in early 2018, there was also the impact of some social unrest in the country. And in a way, the government lost control over some of the indicators that it was really managing well, including inflation, including liquidity amounts in the, and also foreign exchange rates, as you will see on the next graph. This is the exchange rates. Here you can see the timing very well. So Iran had up to roughly May 2018, 2 official rates, one the lower governmental rate and one the free market rate. You can see that both of them were around 40,000 riyals to the US dollar until early 2018. The first hiccup came, as I said, with the social unrest in early 2018. But the real hiccup came May 2018 when the US announced its exit from the JCPOA. The first reaction from the Iranian government was that it will unify the 2 exchange rates. Not only they didn't manage to unify the exchange rates, they actually created a 3rd exchange rate. The red that you see is the so-called importers and exporters exchange rate. Over the past 18 months or so, the free market rate and the importers versus exporters rates have been relatively aligned. But the big differential between the official rate and the free market rate, or the 2nd and 3rd rates, is the biggest problem currently causing or paving the way for corrupt practices. This is where a lot of corruption is taking place. Basically, political appointees or state organizations that have access to the lower rate, using that, and then obviously benefiting from the huge differential. So one of the biggest issues that Iran will have to tackle is this very, corrupt in a way, or unhealthy exchange rate system. And I hope that this will be one of the remedies that they will introduce. So to understand the depth of the crisis, let's look at some facts. It's in terms of the financial pressure on the government, it's a very unprecedented crisis. Iran has faced a lot of crises in the past, such as low oil price or sanctions, but 3 crises concurrently has created a lot of headaches. There has been a calculation, which was actually in the latest issue of the Iran Strategic Focus as well, that the cost of the pandemic on the Iranian economy and on the Iranian government will be about $11 billion. This is not only the not realized or non-realized tax income, but also all the additional costs that the government will have to take care of in terms of redistributive policies towards the lower classes. Furthermore, because of the oil price situation, Iran's planned $10 billion revenues from oil exports will probably be halved. This also obviously depends on the price and also the quantity that they can export. But we have to realize that the main customer of Iranian oil, China, is not importing as much oil as it used to until a few months ago. So Iran has also lost, not only in terms of price, but also in terms of quantities purchased from Iran by China. Obviously, the economic downturn and the collapse of a number of the economic sectors will lead and has already led to non-realization of tax income. And unemployment, I mentioned, expectation is that it will go up to about 12.5% in the current year. And we should never forget, sometimes events take place so quickly that we sometimes forget what actually happened a few months ago. The Iranian government and the Iranian state as a whole was probably at the lowest point of public confidence in January 2020 because of, one, the reaction to the unrests in November 2019. Remember, these unrests emerged when the government suddenly hiked fuel prices, and there were social reactions, there was social unrest, and the clampdown on that unrest left a very bitter taste with the Iranian people. And then in early January 2020, the shooting down of the Ukrainian passenger plane, which really brought down the confidence in 8 institutions in total. So the Iranian government has tried to manage this pandemic and the coincidence of all the different crises while having a very low public support. And that has led to a number of challenges in managing. I mean, in the initial weeks, the Iranian population wasn't listening at all to what the government was instructing. It changed over time because of 2 reasons. One, people started seeing the negative impact of the pandemic. Second, they started seeing that even advanced countries are facing key challenges in managing the pandemic, so the level of cooperation increased. So how has the government responded to all of these challenges? The most important action by the government so far has been the unprecedented level of sale of government assets, not just shares, because everyone immediately refers to privatization and starts calculating the number of government shares that are being sold. The government is selling a lot of its properties, and the Iranian government has a lot of properties, whether it's land or residential and commercial properties and other properties. And by my calculation, it will probably generate some, over the whole year until March 2021, it will generate something like $10 billion for the Iranian government. This has implications, which I will discuss a bit later, but in terms of financial cash flows and filling the budget deficits for the government, it will be very efficient. The government also withdrew about €1 billion from the so-called National Development Fund. This is the sovereign wealth fund that Iran has, which probably has an asset base of about 90 to $100 billion. So the funds are there, but these funds are usually not cash. So when there is a decision to draw down some of these assets, other assets would have to be sold, or there has to be a sort of a process. That's why it's not easy to say within a few weeks to have a few $billion or euros from that fund. It will have to go through a process and probably sale of some assets. Iran has also, for the first time in 60 years, applied for an IMF loan, for a $5 billion emergency loan from the IMF. This will probably not materialize because of US objection, but Iran has every right to do so. It's a member, it's a paying member. It even has reserves in the IMF, but it's probably, it won't happen because of US position to this. Iran has also started negotiating with a number of countries where Iran has reserves. You may remember from the previous wave of sanctions, a lot of Iranian funds, payments for Iranian oil exports to countries like South Korea, to China, to Japan and others, even Europe, they were kept in foreign banks and were never released because the sanctions regime, especially for banks, was structured in a way that it was difficult. And then after a point, the US sanctioned the central bank of Iran, which obviously is the main interlocutor if you want to return these monies to the Iranian state. And that way, a lot of banks are sitting on a lot of Iranian money, but are not able or sometimes not willing to return them. Now, Iran has started engaging a number of governments, and there is some news from South Korea that maybe the South Koreans will be able to secure a license from the US Treasury to return some of this money. Some of this money could also make a difference. Iran, for example, even has won a court ruling to release $1.6 billion of Iranian money sitting in a Luxembourg bank, but we have to wait and see whether the money actually goes. It's more of a diplomatic effort rather than application for a loan or so. The government has also started issuing real bonds. I mean, this is not a new practice, but they have increased the volume, and those of you following what's happening on the Tehran Stock Exchange realize that there is a lot of capital in the country that is looking for safe havens, and government bonds could be one of them. So it's quite conceivable that they will manage to raise some capital from the domestic bond market. The government has also intensified its efforts to increase domestic efficiency. This is very important. Those of you knowing the Iranian economy, you know that we have a lot of inefficiencies. We have inefficiencies in production, we have inefficiencies in distribution, especially distribution of energy, and also in consumption. Some increased efficiency or increased productivity can also help Iran save some money. And usually the Iranian mind sort of works a lot more productively when it's under pressure. So this pressure, this sort of the different crises are helping the government come up with some solutions. I was listening to the first vice president yesterday when he was talking about how much they have already achieved in terms of energy efficiency. We will have to wait and see the figures, but I have no doubt that the effort is there because they know that this is somewhere where they can generate some value or potentially also generate some jobs, needed jobs. There is also an effort to promote regional trade, regional banks, and so on, again, to manage some of the challenges. The government has also initiated a number of redistributive policies. I'm not going to list all of them, but the main target is to help lower income classes manage the current crises and survive. And it's very interesting when you talk to advisors of various government ministries or people who are close to the government or the parliament, you realize that their main focus is to make sure that people remain employed. So it's not just about feeding, like transferring some money to them, but somehow helping them remain employed. And obviously employment, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the biggest challenges in the country. Some other facts that are important. We hear a lot about government selling some of its assets, but it's very interesting that some of the so-called semi-state institutions, the revolutionary and religious and military institutions, have also started selling some of their assets. Most importantly, the name some of you definitely know, the so-called Setad, which manages a large conglomerate of companies and assets under the supervision of the supreme leader, so it's not related to the government, has started selling some of its assets, some of its shares. Now we don't obviously know what they are going to do with the revenues, but there are two things we can imagine. One is that they will release some revenues to be able to buy some of the government shares that are being sold, meaning the ownership of some of the government assets will move to the semi-state institutions. The other scenario, which one can imagine, and where you see some signposts as well, is that they are selling some of their assets so that they can attend more to charitable causes, to helping the lower income classes, to creating some jobs for the sort of more vulnerable classes in society. And this is also important because it's a question of legitimacy. I told you earlier, both the state and also the government had lost a lot of credibility and legitimacy until early January. So regaining that legitimacy may, in a time of crisis, also happen through charitable work. So it's again early to say what they are doing. Most probably they are doing both. But it's important to understand that some of these asset bases in Iran, in the Iranian economy, are moving both from the government, probably from government to semi-state sector, and then from semi-state sector, where they are moving to, we have to analyze later, hopefully to the private sector, because usually the private sector is the most efficient of all. There is also an interesting, I would call it, revival of civil society in Iran. Despite the low government credibility and legitimacy, obviously it's a time of crisis and the civil society wants to help. The civil society in Iran had been restricted over the past few years, and there were a lot of limitations. So this was an opportunity for some of the civil society organizations, whether they were religious or scientific or academic, to come back and to mobilize and fight. The best news for me is that in this crisis, there has been a new impetus, a new momentum in regional cooperation. Partly maybe because everyone realizes that it's a crisis that will hit every country. So helping each other is going to generate a positive outcome for everyone. But partly also, I think everyone in this region was looking for opportunities to ease tensions. There have been a lot of tensions, especially between the key rivals, Iran and Saudi Arabia, and there were lots of areas where these regional powers were engaged in proxy wars. Suddenly we hear talks about easing tensions in Yemen. We hear a lot about various states, including Saudi Arabia, reaching out to Iran, helping Iran. And 2 days ago, the spokesperson of the Iranian Foreign Ministry announced that Iran is fully ready for direct and indirect engagement with Saudi Arabia, which is good news. I hope that the crisis will ease some of the regional tensions, which would be good news, because part of the economic challenges in the region can also be managed by reducing these regional confrontations. Another interesting development, the crisis has also, again, reactivated the Iranian diaspora. The Iranian diaspora is very significant in terms of a source of knowledge and source of capital, but it had sort of been marginalized. The more hardline elements in Iran have arrested a long list of dual citizens, in a way, in my view, to intimidate the Iranian diaspora, to limit their presence in Iran, their activities in Iran. But because of the crisis, a lot of the diaspora members are again reaching out. There are different initiatives to collect money from the Iranian diaspora, and also different processes where they are involved. So with all of that in mind, the big question is, and you have the usual suspects predicting that the Iranian economy will collapse, but they have been predicting that for a long time. My answer to that is it's almost impossible for this economy to collapse, partly because it still has a lot of unused assets. It is very diverse, and it's relatively resilient. We should never forget the Iranian economy has been on the one way or another under sanctions for 40 years. And it's important to understand that this economy is a lot more resilient than many believe. It's going to remain under its real potential for a long time. I mean, I'm not saying that this is economic prosperity in Iran. I mentioned at the outset that mismanagement and corruption are two of the key issues, and those will not disappear very soon. But it's important to understand that it's a much more resilient economy than many believe. Compared to other OPEC countries, when we think about the oil crisis, oil price crisis, obviously the Iranian vulnerability levels are much lower. Iran at best has been exporting between 200 to 400,000 barrels of oil over the past few months. And the price collapse is painful. As I said, oil income, projected oil income for the current year was $10 billion. It will probably go down to $5 billion or less, but it's when we look at the size of the economy. The other fact that's important in Iran is that Iran is actually used to crises. I think when we sort of step back for a second and ask ourselves what the post-corona challenges will be, the big challenge for all the countries is that they will have to face new realities and react to new realities, whether it's in unemployment, whether it's in economic and interactions, trade, production, etc. Well, those countries who know how to deal with complete shifts in realities will be able to manage the post-pandemic crisis better, and Iran is one of those countries. The push for managing this and surviving this will also help the government increase the efficiency. It's there, and in a way, it may again be too early to say, but this crisis has helped Iran to leap really in terms of digitalization. In fact, one of the interesting passages of the vice president's speech I was listening to yesterday was, he was saying up to a few months ago, we were trying to forbid students not to bring their smartphones to the class. Now the entire class has gone into their smartphones. And that is obviously going to push and open up new opportunities, especially because it's such a young and relatively educated population. So Iran will not collapse. And not only it will not collapse, it will probably return to some growth pattern by 2021. But the growth level that the economy needs to really create the jobs that it requires is much higher than what will emerge. So Iran will have to probably post-pandemic grow by 8 to 10% a year to create enough jobs. And that won't happen in the sanctions environment and all the other challenges that we are facing. So what are the political implications? first of all, even before COVID-19, the hardliners had emerged as the key political players, partly because the moderates in Iran lost their legitimacy after the US withdrew from the JCPOA. So the moderates are losing influence, even though the government is still in the hands of the moderates until mid-2021. But the new Majlis, which in fact will take charge in the next few days, will be dominated by hardliners, and this dominance of hardliners will continue as a result of the tense relationships that Iran has. The RGC, which is the main institution within the hardline factions, will try to consolidate its position. It's interesting, in the midst of this crisis, the RGC sent a military satellite into orbit. Everyone will say, why was that important? Well, it was important because, don't forget, they are trying to regain legitimacy. They are trying to show that they are a strong player, both internally and also externally, and that was part of the process. As I said, the thinking of the hardline elements in Iran, especially the RGC, is to project power. Power projection is a strategy for them to prevent wars, to prevent put under pressure. Well, with hardliners in the driving seat, obviously the thinking in the region will also be based on the power projection I just described. Having said that, in some cases, such as Yemen and such as those countries where Iran feels that it's not a strategic country for them, there will be opportunities for de-escalation, even in other countries, but obviously de-escalation, for example, in Iraq between Iran and the US, or in Syria with Israel, will be much more complex. The pandemic has also allowed the European Union, which also was losing credibility because of its inability to help Iran with the JCPOA, to show some goodwill. I mean, the EU released a 20 million euro fund to Iran and activated Instex, and is now, I talked to Instex recently, and their focus is on providing coronavirus related equipment and pharmaceuticals to Iran. And so it's not fulfilling Iran's expectations, but at least it created an opportunity to remind the Iranian side that Europe is still there, Europe is still interested, and obviously a lot will depend on where they stand in regards to the JCPOA in the next few months. The sell-off of government assets that I mentioned earlier will also lead to some political shifts in Iran. Part of the political power of the different institutions in the country is obviously based on their economic power. And if some of the government assets are going from the government to the semi-state institutions, we can imagine that semi-state institutions will be in a better power position in the future, and we have to see how they will try to balance. And obviously, as long as Iran cannot export a lot of oil, the government's main revenue is under pressure, and one can imagine that the semi-state sector will be in a better position. So what does this all mean for international business? Very quickly, it's interesting to highlight that despite all the hiccups, despite the sanctions, payment issues and so on, the EU is still continuing to sell goods to Iran. Based on EU statistics, in 2019, the EU exported something around $5 billion, 5 billion euro of goods to Iran. It's not the volume that Iran had when the sanctions were lifted, but it's still there. So the European companies should not say, well, there is no market for us anymore and there are no payment solutions. It's there and it's possible, especially non-sanctioned goods, pharmaceuticals, food, agriculture. There are even other sectors, I mean, energy efficiency. There are other sectors. Obviously, one has to find the right strategy and the right partner and the right payment strategy, but it's possible. The key bottleneck continues to be payment solutions. Instex is becoming more active. There is also the Swiss Humanitarian Trade Assistance Channel, which has also started activities, even though both of them still need to understand of bank transactions. And as I said, don't forget, with the Iranian central bank being sanctioned by the Americans, you have to find a very solid solution that does not involve the Central Bank of Iran or sanctioned banks. The problem of a growing role for the RGC is that more and more companies in Iran will directly or indirectly be affiliated with the RGC. And that obviously creates a sanctions risk. And that's where companies like Menas Associates come in to help you understand the ownership structures, whether there is a sanctions risk, and if there is one, how to manage it. Having said all of this, I want to just bring it to the attention of our Western listeners here, participants, that the West is losing credibility in Iran. Europe's failure to live up to its commitments within the JCPOA has created a public opinion that's more and more shifting away from Western powers, from Europe and so on. And it's not that there is an open endorsement of Russia and China, but if you move away from Europe, then obviously the big powers that are there are Russia and China, and more you see especially Chinese companies, but also Russian companies active. It doesn't mean the end of opportunities for European companies, but it would mean that you have to also sometimes develop what I call triangle solutions, to look at partnerships with maybe Chinese, Russian, sometimes Turkish, and regional partners to do business. In the absence of, as I said, European companies, you will have to look at third parties and so on. I'm going to stop here. I don't know if Charles has collected the questions, but I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Bijan. That was excellent. Okay, we have about 7 or 8 questions. There are 2 linked on the Tehran bourse, but we'll come back to them in a minute. The first one is on the current debt situation and the impact that the economic contraction is going to have on the defense budget and on foreign military engagement. I wonder if you can talk about that.
So you have to understand the parallel power structure in Iran. I mean, we have a government, and the government has a budget, and within the budget there is obviously a defense budget. And when you go deeper into the defense budget, you realize that the government's defense budget is mainly the salaries of the armed forces. It's not what Iran is doing in other countries, or what kind of military developments there are. Those developments are managed by the 2 military institutions, one the regular army and one the Revolutionary Guards. Both of them are huge organizations. Both of them have their own companies. They have their own economic impetus. They have their own construction arm. And one thing that those forces who sat and designed these sanctions on Iran didn't understand, and probably still don't understand, is that weakening the Iranian government doesn't necessarily weaken the Iranian armed forces, especially not the Revolutionary Guards, because as I said, they have their own economic conglomerates, they have their own regional arm and regional activities. So there is no direct link between the financial position of the Iranian government and the regional activities. Having said that, in fact, in the new Iran strategic focus that you can get for free if you write to Charles, I've written about this, that it's not about adventurism, what Iran is doing in the region. Many describe it that way. It's about national security. You may disagree with the rationale, but the national security rationale is that there are threats, both from regional powers, but also from international powers. And to manage those threats, Iran has created a network of proxies and it uses those proxies to keep those enemies in check. So spending there, whether it's by RGC or by other institutions, is part of the security strategy. And security to Iran is, if not more important, definitely as important as the economic situation. And they are definitely interrelated. So I don't see any major adjustments there. As I mentioned, I do see the opportunity of de-escalation with regional partners if the threat perception changes or shifts, but not because Iran is under pressure. The Iranian mentality is, if you're under pressure, you have to show strength. That's why I said in the middle of these crises, they have successfully sent a military satellite into orbit to show that these types of pressures, these types of crises won't deter the Iranian agenda.
Okay, the next question is on what parts of the Iranian economy are actually earning foreign exchange, and particularly, and in what proportion, and whether oil is earning foreign currency. As you've said many times, Iran is really a service economy, and the oil industry is only 18%. I wonder if you can comment on that.
Mm-hmm. When we focus on export performance, right now, I mean, obviously we have to wait for the new statistics to come out. But if we look at the developments until roughly 2 months ago, apart from oil and condensate that obviously the state was exporting, the top export items were in most cases related to petroleum. You know, apart from gas liquids, various gas liquids, petrochemicals, cement, steel. Iran has become an interesting steel production country and also steel exporter. And then regionally, a lot of light industries. The Iranian food industry is a success story in terms of you know, exporting to the region. Obviously, it's benefiting from the fact that it's not sanctioned and it can more easily work with international companies. So all of these sectors have been generating hard currency, not necessarily hard currency controlled by the government. As I mentioned, there is a currency market called Nima, for those of you who know the Persian term Nima, where exporters and importers basically trade currency. So you do have industries generating money. Again, before the crisis, the tourism industry was generating hard currency, and the tourism sector was growing very, very rapidly. In fact, the success in creating jobs that I mentioned, when unemployment went down to 10.8% or 10.5% even, it was mainly the success of the tourism industry. And with tourism, also another factor called basically health tourism. Iran has been very successfully generating hard currency in health tourism, attracting citizens from the neighboring countries and offering health tourism services. Obviously, all of these services will be under a lot of pressure. I mean, tourism, both regional and international and also domestic, have been undermined, and we have to wait and see how these sectors will come out of the situation, the crisis.
All right. The next question is on the real economy. What are the real bright spots for investment going forward, both domestically and foreign?
As I said, we are dealing with a phenomenon in the Tehran Stock Exchange. I mean, Tehran Stock Exchange has grown enormously. My personal analysis is that it's obviously because a number of other investment targets, such as the housing market, such as the hard currency and gold markets, have not been very attractive over the past couple of years, and that a lot of the capital has moved towards the stock exchange. And in the stock exchange, mainly the focus has been on those exporting companies I mentioned: cement, petrochemicals, sometimes pharmaceuticals, depending on the company, again, exporting food companies. But the other phenomenon in terms of, if you look at it as an, investment opportunity, I mentioned digitalization or a digital leap in Iran. I think anyone investing in digital solutions that would, for example, facilitate online education, online meetings, online working, will benefit from. Iran has 83 million population, relatively active population, relatively urban population, looking for these types of solutions. So digitalization, communication. I was reading an article or a report this morning that was talking about the need for mobile and online payments solutions, so payments, both hardware but also software. So there are quite a few opportunities that one can develop. And down the line, even though tourism has been undermined currently, but I think midterm investment opportunities in Iran will be in the tourism sector. Iran is a relatively secure, compared to its peers, secure country for tourism and tourists, regional tourists, international tourists, but also domestic tourists. I mean, there may be, depending on how the travel industry emerges after this crisis, there may be more and more Iranians who will just stay in the country and travel to different places. And so travel infrastructure and tourism infrastructure and also health tourism infrastructure are all safe investment opportunities. For international investors, for a couple of years now, I have said, if you have a solution to increase efficiencies, especially energy efficiency, Iran will be a very safe place in terms of outlook for your investment. I mean, Iran is still a country where saving a barrel of oil is cheaper than producing a barrel of oil.
All right.
And we know that with a lot of modern solutions, one can achieve that.
All right, we've got lots of questions, so can you keep the answers reasonably short?
Sure.
Can you provide an update on clause 44 of the privatization sale of government assets? And can you comment on the recent devaluation of the currency from the real to the tuman?
Sure. Obviously, Article 44 is a long topic, but Article 44 was the constitutional article that had to be reinterpreted so that the government could sell most of its assets. Basically, in the Article 44 said, defined a number of industries as government owned. And that's why, for example, banking, insurance, a lot of companies, energy, etc., could not be privatized before the reinterpretation. And when they reinterpreted it in 2005, 2006, they said the constitution doesn't say that the government has to own all of these industries, but that it should regulate all of these industries. So in every single industry, with the exception of upstream oil and gas, in every other industry that was mentioned there, they created what they refer to as the government mother company. And that government mother company sort of started operating and privatizing up to 80% of all the other businesses. Now, one can always ask, if they sold everything there and they could not, by law, they cannot sell, they have to maintain 20% share. So what are they selling now? Now, what are they selling now is a number of holding companies, Iranian holding companies that still own shares in those privatized companies. And some of them are, I mean, the largest IPO in Iranian history was a couple of weeks ago when they sold 10% of the investment arm of the Social Security company. This is one of those holding companies. But Article 44, whoever needs more information, we need to have a different session on. The currency, the change in the currency, which has now been passed as a law, means that Iran will remove 4 zeros from its currency. So right now, to give you one example, right now on the free market rate, the $1 is 175,000 riyals. Removing 4 zeros means the new, with the new currency, which will be called Toman, $1 would be 17.5 Toman. I think it's mainly a prestige issue. It's not, economically it will make some sense because they don't have to print as much banknotes and obviously can coin a lot of coins rather than, or mint a lot of coins rather than banknotes. So there will be a cost effect, but it's more prestige. It sounds much nicer if $1 is 17 tomans rather than 170,000 riyals. I hope I answered both questions.
Yeah. Fine. Okay, there's a political question now about, are there any possible upcoming negotiations with the US? There have been signs for it like prisoner exchange and cooperation in Iraq. Shall we expect these to be public negotiations? And if so, will they take place within Rouhani's presidency?
I think Iran was definitely interested up to a few months ago, and there were a number of initiatives, especially the plan put forward by President Macron, the so-called 4-point plan. And I think that the two presidents came relatively close to maybe agreeing to a meeting in New York in September last year. But I think, especially since the beginning of this COVID-19 crisis, the sort of Iran file has lost its maybe significance in Washington. The US file hasn't lost its significance in Iran, but the Iranians will never, I repeat, never negotiate out of a position of weakness, at least perceived weakness. What, for example, the Macron plan provided was a framework where both sides could come to the table and both sides could be present the situation as a win-win situation and try to resolve their issues. What the US expects now, and this shows the fact that the maximum pressure campaign has continued despite calls from many people to ease the sanctions in the current crisis. The US, I guess some forces in Washington wish to see a regime collapse or at least an economic collapse so that Iran would have to beg for negotiations, or they want Iran to surrender and come to the negotiating table out of a position of weakness. The Iranians won't do that. Culturally, even if the economic pressure is larger, they won't do that. It's just against their thing. That's why I said, I mean, showing strength, power projection, this is the language of the hardliners. And by exiting the JCPOA and weakening the moderates, one has to unfortunately now live with the expectations of the hardliners. And the hardliners, they will have to prove and they will have to be perceived as strong before they can come to the negotiating table. My prediction is the Iranians will wait until the US elections. After the US elections, depending on who wins, there could be a new initiative, especially if again, some strong third parties come forward. But I think they will definitely wait for the outcome of the US elections. Rouhani will still be in power until July 2021. So depending on the dynamics in Washington, depending on the personalities, so even a Trump re-election, the big question will be who will be the Secretary of State, who will be the Secretary of Defense, and what will be the situation on the ground in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in the Persian Gulf. So I wouldn't rule it out, but I think it has become less and less likely that anything would happen before the elections.
Okay, in relation to Iraq, Iraq's reliant on Iranian gas and also electricity. The US has granted Iraq a 120-day sanction waiver. Can you have some more insight on this? but please be brief. We have another 9 or 10 questions.
Yeah, I mean, the US keeps reissuing these waivers, and fact on the ground is that Iraq doesn't have many choices. As long as there is no alternative, it will be very difficult to limit Iraq. But the US has played a game. I mean, you could also see that in the recent extension of the waiver was initially shorter until there was a new government in Baghdad, and then it was extended by 3 months. So the US is using it both towards the Iraqi government, but also towards the Iranians. But on the ground, there are not that many alternatives. So I think it will continue unless the dynamics in Washington changes, which I think some of the participants are more qualified to comment on Washington than I am.
All right, I think you answered one on the Tehran Stock Exchange already, so I won't repeat it. Therefore, can you comment on the next presidential election in Iran and what's likely to happen?
Well, absent any major improvement in the economic situation and also, as I said, the credibility of the moderates in Iran, we have to assume that the hardliners, sort of the coalition between hardliners and conservatives, would be the most likely winners of the 2021 elections. So we have a similar situation to what happened in 2004. The conservatives won the Majlis, and in 2005, they produced Ahmadinejad as the next president. So I don't think we will have another Ahmadinejad. I think the lessons learned from the Ahmadinejad era have helped all the political stakeholders to understand the risks. But I wouldn't be surprised if someone like the former mayor of Tehran, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who is also the likely new speaker of the new Majlis, emerges as a candidate. So a candidate that's probably affiliated with the RGC, affiliated with the more hardline elements. And as I said, that will be the setting for Iran for a few years until the international climate and the economic situation paves the way for the moderates to return. So it's not a very positive outlook right now.
All right. Can you elaborate a bit on the privatization of the Social Security Investment Organization, Shasta, and the impact that had on the Tehran Stock Exchange?
As I said, it was the largest IPO. I don't think it changed the realities on the stock exchange that much. I mean, obviously, emotionally, it was important because it was the government ceding some of its control over one of the largest organizations in the country. But it was the trend on the stock exchange had started way before the privatization of Shasta. I mean, some people talk about the possibility that the government or the state as a whole intentionally sort of fed capital into the stock market to make it more interesting, so that when the IPO came, there was a lot of liquidity and a lot of willingness to invest in those shares. But I don't think it has changed the overall dynamics. As I said, the new question for me is, who is buying these shares? I assume that a lot of these shares are being bought by the semi-state institutions. And as I mentioned in the presentation, that will change some of the political composition in the country.
All right. Can you say something about fuel exports to Venezuela?
I don't think it's I don't think we should look at it as a sort of economic strategy. I think it's more of a political statement. Venezuela and Iran have had good relations since the Ahmadinejad years. Back then, it was part of the Iranian strategy to in a way annoy Washington and to say, well, if you put pressure on us, we also find states that oppose you or are adversaries to you. Right now, it's more of a showing that Iran stands by its friends and its allies. The current government, in my view, doesn't necessarily consider Venezuela a strategic ally the same way Ahmadinejad was looking at them. But still, it's important to them to show that, you know, they care. And don't forget, the sanctions and the market situation has led to this to a situation where Iran has a lot of surplus oil and also fuel, and it was an opportunity to place some of that surplus fuel in a new market. As I said, I don't see that as a strategy that Iran will now start exporting fuel to far countries. Iran's strategy has always been to remain within the geographical vicinities of the country in terms of access to markets. They know that regular exports to a country like Venezuela or to South America will face other issues like sanctions on the shipping lines and so on.
All right, there's a technical question on foreign exchange, which I think I'll leave for the moment. Apologies to whoever did it. There's a question here on the recent cyber war with Israel. Is that just noise, or is it likely to escalate? And is it a proxy war being sought by the Saudis?
Well, the cyber war between Iran and Israel, I think it has existed for a long time. We just never heard about it, because I think this time it was the first time that the allegedly Iranian attack was on a civilian infrastructure. It's basically, the cyber attack was against the water facilities in Israel, and the Israeli reaction was very interesting. They were saying, well, you don't do this, as if Israel it has very clean hands in terms of what you do in international warfare. So I think there has already been an Israeli retaliation against a port facility in Iran, again a cyber attack, and I think this type of attack will continue between Iran and Israel. I mean, the two have been engaged in a war, information war, propaganda war, cyber war, and I think this will continue until they find some sort of a modus vivendi in terms of how they regulate their relationship. Unfortunately, that will continue. With Saudi Arabia, I have a feeling that both sides are more willing to think differently about their relationship. Obviously, from the Iranian perspective, Saudi Arabia has been a top US ally, and the Iran-US relationship has always had a major shadow on Iran-Saudi relationship. But I think what changed the equation in a way was the realization in Saudi Arabia that maybe the US is not the power that will come to Saudi's rescue if anything happens. In other words, the need to accommodate the regional relations in a different way. The Saudis have been very slow, but if we look at the UAE has already reopened some security talks with Iran. I mentioned the recent support for Iran from all the states. I think there is a new dynamics. I know that Iraq and also Pakistan also mediated between the two sides. It was interesting that when General Soleimani was assassinated in Iraq, that the Iraqi prime minister said that he had come to Baghdad to deliver a message regarding Iran-Saudi negotiations. So there are signs that there is a different degree of willingness, but it depends on so many other factors. As I said, Iran-US relations, Saudi-US relations, developments in Iraq, Syria, etc. But I hope that there will be a more positive atmosphere in the relationship.
All right, I think we have three short questions, please, the last three. Iran's quest for second and third leap of petrochemical sector, is this part of a broader diversification strategy for sustainable development?
Yes, I mean, there is a push to develop more value, let's call it sort of value creation in the petrochemical sector. Obviously, Iran has the potential, Iran has the industrial base, Iran has the gas resources, independent gas resources, and Iran obviously has access to markets. We should never underestimate the fact that Iran has 15 neighbors and access to warm waters and so on. And in fact, one of the most interesting developments is this greater investment in domestic capacity building let's say, higher technology. For example, there is a very conscious development of various high-tech filters that you use in the petrochemical sector in the country. And most of these items are being produced locally so that the development of the industry cannot be hurt by sanctions again. So there is a push, and the main objective is what they call greater resilience and ability to sustain economic activity even under sanctions.
All right, last two questions. There's no negotiations with the US until the elections. Will Iran push diplomatically to get its European partners to release assets?
Certainly, certainly. I mean, I mentioned the one in Luxembourg, but there are other opportunities for Iran to engage. Some of the, unfortunately, I have to say, for the dual nationals that have been arrested by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, some of them are connected to, Iranian assets in European countries that Iran or the RGC wants to release. So this whole dynamics of, the dual, I call it dual track. On the one side, diplomatic engagement; on the other side, pressure tactics is going forward to release some of these assets. The big question is whether Iran will try to sustain the JCPOA in the discussions with the Europeans, especially considering that the Europeans have basically initiated the dispute resolution mechanism. My view is Iran will try to sustain the JCPOA. There is also a big issue coming up in October based on the JCPOA and the UN Security Council resolution. The arms embargo on Iran should be lifted. And Iran obviously is interested for that. I mean, it's not just about arms imports, it's also about arms exports. And the Iranians would be very interested to continue that. And they know that sustaining the JCPOA will depend on the relationship, the working relationship with the Europeans.
All right, a final question on the Iranian petroleum contract. Will it be the new unique model contract for future petroleum contracts, or can buyback contracts still be used?
I think Iran would be open to negotiations. I mean, right now, the prospect of getting major international investment into the petroleum sector is not there. But as soon as, let's say, either through negotiations or through a shift in the sanctions policy, the opportunity emerges. I think Iran is so interested in getting new investments and technology into this petroleum sector that I think the contractual framework would be open to negotiations. Iran has certain constitutional and legal restrictions, limitations, but within those limitations, I think whether you call it buyback or IPC or something new, they will be interested to attract international investors. You're on mute, Charles.
Yeah, sorry, that seems like a very positive way to end. I just wanted to thank you and everyone for attending. Also to say that the podcast will be available tomorrow and we'll email that to you. Our next talk will be on the 17th of June when my brother, who's the editor-in-chief of the Washington Examiner, he'll be talking about US politics at that time. So thank you very much for joining us and have a good rest of the day. Many thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.